What if the story of one of our most important inventions doesn't start with a useful tool, but with a 26,000-year-old piece of art? We're about to dig into the surprising history of ceramics, and trust me, it's nothing like you'd expect.
Just for a second, really think about it. When I say the first ceramics, what's the first image that pops into your head? It's probably something very specific, right? Something useful.
Yeah, I bet you're picturing a simple clay pot. You know, something our early ancestors would use to store grain or maybe cook a meal over a fire. It just makes sense, doesn't it? A brand new material must have been invented to solve a basic problem of survival.
But what if that whole idea is wrong? What if the very first things people ever made out of fired clay had nothing to do with cooking or storage? What if they were art? Tiny, symbolic figures of animals and humans, crafted thousands of years before anyone ever thought to make a pot.
And that, right there, is the big mystery we're diving into. Why on earth would our Ice Age ancestors invent a whole new, complex technology just to make art? Why sculptures before soup bowls?
Well, it's because the history of technology is never a simple straight line. People play, they experiment, they create for reasons that have nothing to do with practicality. And sometimes what we think of as the real use for an invention, well, that comes way, way later.
So to really get this, we need to go on a little trip, back in time to the exact spot where this incredible evidence was first dug up.
Our story kicks off at a site called Dolní Věstonice in the modern-day Czech Republic. Now, this wasn't just some random cave. This place was a major hub for mammoth hunting communities. You can almost think of it as a kind of prehistoric innovation center.
And the stuff they found here is about 26,000 years old. Let that number sink in. We are not talking about early farming villages here. We are deep, deep in the Ice Age.
So, what did they pull out of the ground? Thousands of little fired clay objects. We're talking figurines of animals like lions and mammoths, human figures, including the world-famous Venus of Dolní Věstonice. But here's the real kicker. Look at what's missing. No bowls, no jars, not a single pot. They had the tech, but they weren't making pottery.
Okay, to solve this mystery, we have to hit pause for a second and crack the code on two little words that people often mix up, but which mean totally different things.
First, you've got ceramic. Think of this as the big, giant umbrella category. It means anything made from clay that's been shaped and then baked with heat to make it hard. A brick is a ceramic, a tile is a ceramic, a sculpture is a ceramic.
And this is the key. Pottery is just one specific type of ceramic. The word only refers to vessels, pots, bowls, jars. So the people at Dolní Věstonice, they were absolute masters of ceramics, but they weren't potters.
Okay, so they were making these cool little figurines. But you might be wondering, was this a real intentional technology? Or did some clay just, fall into a campfire by mistake? Well, the evidence is overwhelming.
No way this was an accident. This was what we call pyrotechnology, the deliberate, skillful use of fire to transform materials. These were, for all intents and purposes, Ice Age engineers at work.
I mean, just look at this. Analysis shows these objects were fired in a really controlled temperature range, somewhere between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius. You do not get that kind of consistency by just tossing something into a fire. That takes knowledge, it takes specially built hearths or kilns, and it takes a ton of skill.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing. At this one site alone, archaeologists have found over 5,700 of these fired clay pieces. This wasn't some weekend hobby. This was a massive cultural tradition, a full-on prehistoric workshop.
So, if the first ceramics were these figurines in Europe, where and when did people finally get around to making actual pots? Well, for that answer, we have to completely change our map and our timeline.
To find the world's very first pottery, actual vessels, we have to travel all the way from Ice Age Europe over to East Asia, to places like the Shenrendong Cave in China. This timeline really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? You've got ceramic figurines showing up in Europe around 26,000 years ago, but the first actual pots don't appear for another 6,000 years and on a totally different continent. And then it takes another 10,000 years before pottery becomes a common, worldwide technology tied to farming. It's not one single story, it's many.
So, what's the big lesson here? Why does this ancient story about art and clay actually matter to us today?
It all comes back to that central, nagging question. If you have the skill to make ceramics, why would you choose to make art instead of, say, a cooking pot? Well, archaeologists have a few really compelling ideas. For one, these people probably already had perfectly good containers made from things like woven baskets or animal skins. And second, if you're a mobile hunter-gatherer, fragile, heavy clay pots are the last thing you want to lug around. But maybe the biggest reason is that their social and ritual needs, the need for stories, for symbols, for connection, were just a higher priority. Maybe for them, the whole point was the process of making something together.
And this, right here, is the most powerful takeaway from this whole thing. Capability does not automatically produce adoption. Just because you can do something with a technology doesn't mean you will. Culture, needs, and human priorities are what really shape the path an invention takes.
Which leaves us with a final thought. It took thousands of years for ceramics to go from art to soup bowls. So what new tech do we have right now that we're mostly using for play, for art, for connecting with each other, long before we figured out what its ultimate practical purpose is even going to be?